Part 6. Alibaba, the Regulatory Storm. Ant Group, Antitrust, State Scrutiny, Restructuring, Leadership Changes, and the Return to Core Focus, 2020 through 2024. To understand Alibaba between 2020 and 2024, it helps to begin with a simple reversal. For roughly 2 decades, the company had been admired as the most expansive private business system in Chinese internet history. It built marketplaces, then trust tools, then payments, then logistics, then cloud infrastructure, then local services, entertainment, overseas commerce, software, and finance-adjacent products. Each layer seemed to reinforce the others. The story before 2020 was about compounding adjacency. The story after 2020 was about the danger of too much adjacency. Once the Chinese state decided that large platform companies could not be allowed to shape finance, competition, data, and public behavior on their own terms, Alibaba's greatest strength also became its greatest vulnerability. The regulatory storm, therefore, did not merely punish isolated conduct. It forced Alibaba to renegotiate the logic of its own existence. The first phase of the storm began with a tone problem that quickly became a power problem. On October 24, 2020, at the Bund Summit in Shanghai, Jack Ma delivered what sounded to many listeners like a familiar Ma performance: provocative, theatrical, impatient with convention, delighted by the contrast between old institutions and new technology. He criticized the habits of traditional banking and regulatory orthodoxy, famously saying that Chinese banks operated with a pawn-shop mentality. He also derided elements of global financial rulemaking as the work of an old men's club. In a different setting, these lines might have been cataloged as founder bravado. In that setting, on the eve of Ant Group's blockbuster listing, they landed like a challenge. Ant was not a normal internet company preparing for a normal IPO. It was a financial technology colossus built atop the payment rails, data, and consumer behavior that had been assembled through Alipay and then extended through lending, wealth management, insurance distribution, and credit infrastructure. Investors were preparing for a record-setting dual listing in Shanghai and Hong Kong that aimed to raise about $37 billion at a valuation around $315 billion. That valuation alone said something important. Ant was no longer being judged as a convenient payments utility inside a commerce ecosystem. It was being judged as one of the most important financial technology platforms on Earth. But the structure of Ant's business had already begun to worry regulators. Ant had built massive scale in consumer and small business lending by originating demand through its platforms and partnering with banks that would carry much of the balance sheet risk. In broad terms, it had learned how to use technology, data, distribution, and ecosystem lock-in to reach users more efficiently than traditional financial institutions, while avoiding parts of the capital burden those institutions had long accepted as the price of being banks. That was not illegal in the crude sense of blatant lawbreaking, yet it represented precisely the kind of regulatory arbitrage that becomes intolerable once a system decides it has become too large to ignore. The response came with stunning speed. On November 2, 2020, Chinese regulators summoned Jack Ma, Ant Chairman Eric Jing, and CEO Simon Hu for supervisory talks. The next day, the Shanghai Stock Exchange suspended Ant's Star Market listing, citing the regulatory interviews and changes in the fintech regulatory environment as material events that could affect Ant's qualifications and disclosures. Hong Kong followed by freezing the H-share leg of the deal. The official logic, later explained by the China Securities Regulatory Commission, was that new oversight conditions could materially affect Ant's business structure and profit model, making a rushed listing inconsistent with investor protection and fair disclosure. The suspension was more than a transaction failure. It was a public reclassification of Ant from market champion to policy problem. That distinction mattered for Alibaba because Ant's prestige had long reflected back onto the parent ecosystem. Alipay had begun as a trust mechanism for Taobao, then evolved into a payment platform, then into one of the great data and financial distribution machines of the Chinese digital economy. The halt, therefore, announced a broader truth. The state no longer accepted the private sector narrative that innovation itself justified the existing architecture. In retrospect, Jack Ma's speech was less the cause than the accelerant. The underlying tensions had already been built into Ant's business model, into the growth of consumer lending outside traditional banking channels, into the concentration of user data, and into the relationship between platform power and formal financial supervision. But the speech stripped away ambiguity. It turned a quiet regulatory unease into a visible test of authority. If Beijing had allowed Ant to proceed after that performance, it would have signaled either acquiescence or weakness. Instead, the state chose demonstration. By late December, the demonstration had broadened into a blueprint for remaking Ant. The People's Bank of China and other financial regulators publicly described Ant's problems in unusually severe language: weak corporate governance, poor compliance awareness, regulatory arbitrage, the use of market advantage to squeeze out competitors, and harm to consumers' lawful interests. Regulators then listed the remedial path. Ant was told to return to the roots of payments, improve transaction transparency, end unfair competition, operate personal credit businesses lawfully, protect personal information, establish a financial holding company, meet capital and related party requirements, and rectify lending, insurance, wealth management, securities, and asset securitization activities. The message beneath the wording was simple and brutal. Ant had grown by behaving like a shapeshifter between technology and finance. Regulators were now forcing it to pick a more governable form. It would have to carry more capital, submit to clearer licensing structures, accept more direct oversight, and surrender the idea that it could remain both systemically important and loosely supervised. For Alibaba, the halt of the Ant IPO was therefore not an isolated embarrassment. It marked the end of one era of founder-led expansion and the beginning of a long period in which political legitimacy, compliance architecture, and strategic restraint would matter as much as innovation and growth. If the Ant ITO suspension was the spark, antitrust enforcement was the hammer. The second phase of the storm shifted the focus from financial risk to market power in commerce itself. For years, Alibaba's domestic marketplaces had benefited from scale advantages so overwhelming that many merchants treated them less as channels than as economic habitat. Scale had given Alibaba more buyers, more data, more traffic, more seller dependence, more advertising revenue, and more ability to shape the rules of participation. In ordinary business language, this looked like competitive advantage. In the emerging regulatory language of platform governance, it looked like dominance in need of correction. A key practice sat at the center of the case: the exclusivity arrangement, often described in China as choose one from two. Merchants who wanted prominent treatment, traffic support, or commercial peace were often pressured not to operate on rival platforms. The exact mechanisms could vary, and the degree of coercion could be hard to document in public, but the core logic was familiar. Alibaba's scale allowed it to make loyalty costly to break. A marketplace that should have functioned as infrastructure for open competition could instead become a gatekeeper that punished multi-homing. In November 2020, only days after Ant's listing was stopped, China published draft anti-monopoly rules for internet platforms. Timing mattered here. The move signaled that the authorities were not merely disciplining Ant as a fintech outlier, they were preparing a broader doctrine for platform power. Then, in December, the State Administration for Market Regulation opened a formal antitrust investigation into Alibaba. The state was no longer hinting, it was now building a case. That case culminated on April 10, 2021, when SAMRR imposed a record 18 billion yuan fine, roughly $2.75 billion at the time. The regulator concluded that Alibaba had abused its market dominance since 2015 by restricting merchants from selling on competing platforms. Financially, the fine was survivable. Politically, symbolically, and strategically, it was devastating. Alibaba had long lived under the assumption that extraordinary scale was a fact to be managed, not a public offense to be corrected. The fine destroyed that assumption. It is important not to misunderstand what the fine meant. It did not signal an attempt to destroy Alibaba. Beijing did not want to tear out one of the central pieces of Chinese digital commerce. The goal was more surgical and more profound. The state wanted to strip away the behavioral prerogatives that had come with dominance. Alibaba could remain large, but it could no longer behave as though market leadership entitled it to set the boundaries of the market itself. The antitrust pressure also coincided with a shift in competition. Even before regulators intervened, Alibaba's domestic core had begun to face sharper challenges from lower price, more social, or more content-driven rivals. Pinduoduo had shown that growth could come from price aggression, gamified demand, and value perception rather than from polished marketplace incumbency. Douyin was proving that commerce could be embedded into entertainment and algorithmic discovery. JD remained strong in categories where logistics and first-party retail discipline mattered. In other words, Alibaba was hit by the state just as the market was becoming less forgiving. That combination mattered because exclusivity had functioned as both moat and lubricant. It protected share, reduced seller leakage, and reinforced the self-fulfilling logic of scale. Once regulators forced that mechanism into retreat, Alibaba had to compete more on product quality, merchant economics, fulfillment, content, and user experience. This is one reason the post-crackdown era cannot be understood simply as a story of fines and official pressure. It was also a story of weakened commercial reflexes being exposed at the very moment they became harder to defend. The state made clear that Alibaba's case was exemplary. Days after the fine, Chinese regulators warned internet platforms to learn from it. They singled out exclusivity practices as deeply harmful and demanded root and branch correction. The point was performative as well as administrative. Alibaba's punishment was intended to discipline the wider platform economy, from food delivery to ride-hailing to gaming and media. If the country's largest e-commerce company could be punished at record scale, no platform could assume it sat above the line. For Alibaba's management, this had several effects. First, it accelerated the internal realization that growth through coercive marketplace leverage was politically untenable. Second, it increased the importance of governance theater becoming governance reality. Internal controls, compliance committees, and decision frameworks had to be visible, not just asserted. Third, it made future capital allocation choices more consequential. Money spent on diversification now had to compete with the need to defend core commerce under tighter rules and fiercer competition. There was also a subtler psychological effect. The old Alibaba had believed, not without reason, that it understood China's consumer internet better than anyone else because it had helped create that terrain. The antitrust case was a reminder that historical centrality can curdle into regulatory vulnerability. The more integral Alibaba became to day-to-day commercial life, the less tolerance authorities had for private rulemaking inside that space. This was the real meaning of the antitrust onslaught. The state was not only correcting specific conduct, it was rewriting the compact between platform leaders and public authority. Alibaba could still make markets, it could not presume the rights to govern them as a semi-sovereign actor. That distinction would hang over every strategic decision that followed, from the design of algorithms to the structure of new business units to the language the company used to describe itself to investors. After monopoly in finance came the third layer of the campaign: control over data, algorithms, cybersecurity, and the politically sensitive infrastructure that underlay platform power. This phase is easy to flatten into a slogan about state influence, but the reality was more textured. Beijing was not simply trying to seize assets in a crude sense, it was trying to ensure that institutions with massive behavioral data, recommendation engines, payment flows, and cloud infrastructure could not operate outside a denser lattice of supervision and state-compatible governance. For Ant, data sat near the center of the problem. The company had built an extraordinary informational advantage through Alipay and related services. That data helped power credit assessment, merchant evaluation, risk scoring, and cross-selling. Regulators increasingly viewed that informational concentration as too important to remain under light private control, especially given Ant's scale in consumer finance. In 2021 and 2022, this concern took organizational form. Plans emerged for a personal credit scoring joint venture, Xiantang Credit Rating, in which Ant would hold only 35%, while state-backed firms would own large stakes alongside it. Reuters reported that state-linked investors, including Zhejiang Tourism Investment Group and other local government-related entities, would occupy a substantial share of the structure. The design served several purposes at once. It reduced Ant's unilateral control over a valuable data asset, made regulatory oversight easier, and symbolized the principle that data with quasi-public significance could not sit entirely under the command of a private tech finance platform. Ant's broader financial overhaul moved in the same direction. Regulators pushed the firm toward a licensed financial holding company framework and toward more bank-like capital discipline in consumer lending. Ant's consumer finance arm later increased its registered capital substantially, bringing in a more supervised and capitalized structure for businesses that had once grown with extraordinary speed through platform distribution and partner bank funding. The result was not a full dismemberment of Ant, but a domestication of it. A company that had once embodied the dream of software-eating finance was being told that finance, in the end, still came with licensing, capital, governance, and data constraints that software alone could not dissolve. Alibaba itself faced a parallel broadening of scrutiny. The cloud division, once celebrated mainly as a national champion in enterprise technology, came under cybersecurity pressure. In late 2021, Chinese regulators suspended an information-sharing partnership with Alibaba Cloud after the company was accused of failing to promptly report and address a major cybersecurity vulnerability involving the Log4j software flaw. This incident mattered not just because it embarrassed the cloud unit, but because it reminded everyone that cloud infrastructure is not merely a commercial product, it is strategic plumbing. In an environment where data sovereignty, cyber resilience, and geopolitical technology risk had become central state concerns, the operating standards for a cloud champion were no longer judged only by growth. Then there were algorithms. In 2022, the Cyberspace Administration of China published lists of algorithms used by major platforms, including Alibaba's Taobao. The significance was easy to miss if one focused only on the bureaucratic mechanics, but the message was unmistakable. Recommendation systems, ranking tools, traffic allocation mechanisms, and user modeling engines had become objects of state legibility. Beijing no longer wanted to hear that algorithms were just proprietary black boxes belonging to private firms. It wanted the right to classify, inspect, discipline, and in some domains even morally frame them.
Official algorithm rules that took effect in 2022 required greater transparency, protections against certain manipulative or discriminatory uses, and more explicit obligations around public interest, user rights, and social order. This widened the definition of compliance. In the old Internet model, compliance could be imagined as legal hygiene layered onto a fundamentally growth-first machine. In the new model, the growth machine itself had to become inspectable. Product design, recommendation architecture, ranking logic, data governance, and even the language around user engagement all had to pass through a more political filter. This mattered deeply for Alibaba because its businesses were not isolated apps. They were coordinated systems in which commerce, advertising, search, logistics, payments, mapping, local services, and cloud infrastructure fed one another. There was a second-order effect as well. Once the state pushed into algorithms and data, competitive advantage built on opaque ecosystem integration became harder to wield. If regulators want to know how ranking works, how labels are assigned, how user data are used, and how consumer outcomes are shaped, then the frictionless monetization of ecosystem power begins to slow. The company can still innovate, but innovation must now coexist with a new burden of explainability and with the knowledge that some forms of optimization may be reinterpreted as abuses. At the same time, the political mood around platforms was not static. By 2022, China's slowing economy and the damage from prolonged zero-COVID policies led leaders to signal support for the platform economy. Officials, such as Vice Premier Liu He, delivered soothing language, and the Politburo indicated a desire to stabilize growth. This did not mean the old permissive era had returned. It meant the state wanted both discipline and usefulness. Tech champions were to be governed more tightly, yet also encouraged to contribute to employment, consumption, innovation, and strategic resilience. That duality shaped Alibaba's next moves. The company could not simply wait out the storm in hopes of restoration, nor could it assume it was being crushed into irrelevance. Instead, it had to adapt to a system in which political trust would be rebuilt through compliance, structural adjustment, and a clearer alignment with nationally useful sectors such as cloud infrastructure and later artificial intelligence. The period of expanding scrutiny therefore set the stage for the corporate experiment that followed, the attempt to reorganize Alibaba into something more agile, more modular, more governable, and perhaps more acceptable. By early 2023, Alibaba needed a response large enough to match the scale of pressure it had absorbed. That response arrived in March with one of the most dramatic restructurings in Chinese corporate history. Alibaba announced that it would remake itself into a holding company overseeing 6 major business groups and a wider cluster of other businesses, the famous 1+6+N framework. On the surface, the move looked like a capital markets story. Separate units could raise outside funding, sharpen accountability, and eventually seek independent public listings. But the deeper logic was broader. The restructuring was an attempt to solve several problems at once: regulatory overhang, strategic sprawl, managerial sluggishness, investor frustration, and the operational inertia that afflicts giant integrated systems. Daniel Zhang, in his 2023 letter to shareholders, framed the move as a natural progression from earlier attempts to build a more agile organization. In official terms, 1 would be Alibaba's holding company, the 6 would be Cloud Intelligence Group, Taobao and Tmall Group, Local Services Group, Alibaba International Digital Commerce Group, Cainiao Smart Logistics Network, and Digital Media and Entertainment Group. The N would cover businesses such as Alibaba Health, Sun Art, and Freshipo. Each entity would establish its own board, while, with the exception of Taobao and Tmall, the major groups could raise outside capital and potentially pursue IPOs. It was an extraordinary declaration. For 2 decades, Alibaba had been the archetype of an ecosystem company, a business whose power came precisely from the dense interlocking of marketplaces, traffic, payments, logistics, data, and technology. Now it was arguing that value might be unlocked by making the pieces more independent. This was not exactly a confession that the old ecosystem had failed. It was a recognition that the old ecosystem, under new conditions, had become too difficult to manage and too difficult to defend. One way to read the restructuring is as a strategic release valve. Regulators were wary of concentrated power. Investors were frustrated by the conglomerate discount hanging over Alibaba's share price. Executives inside the businesses likely wanted clearer responsibility and less reliance on a giant central apparatus. By converting the group into a portfolio with semi-autonomous operating companies, Alibaba could present itself as more market-disciplined, more transparent, and less like a monolith that governed half the digital economy from one center. But another reading is more defensive. 1 plus 6 plus N also looked like an attempt to make Alibaba governable after the storm. A smaller decision loop inside each business group would, in theory, make correction easier. Boards and capital structures could impose sharper discipline. Sensitive areas, such as cloud, could develop their own identity and compliance perimeter. Units with weaker strategic fit could seek external capital rather than remain permanently subsidized by the core. In this sense, decentralization was also a way of telling regulators the giant system you fear is being modularized. At first, the plan generated real excitement. Analysts saw potential value creation in separate listings. The cloud division, in particular, seemed to command a higher multiple on its own because public markets often reward infrastructure and AI exposure more richly than mature commerce. Cainiao had a plausible equity story as a logistics and supply chain platform. Freshipo, though more complicated, at least offered a distinct retail tech narrative. The restructuring seemed to promise both financial and strategic clarity. Yet the plan contained tensions from the beginning. Alibaba's businesses were separable on paper, but deeply entangled in practice. Cainiao derived enormous strategic value from being woven into commerce flows. Cloud was not just another asset, it was the technology substrate for a large share of the group's future ambitions, especially as AI gained prominence. Taobao and Tmall were exempt from outside fundraising because they remained the center of gravity. In other words, Alibaba was decentralizing while still depending on the logic of ecosystem reinforcement. That is a hard trick to sustain. Those tensions became visible over time. Some transactions moved ahead in concept. Cainiao filed for an IPO in Hong Kong in September 2023. Freshipo explored its route. Alibaba International Digital Commerce sought external capital. But then the environment turned against the grand vision. In November 2023, Alibaba scrapped the cloud spinoff, explicitly citing uncertainty created by U.S. export restrictions on advanced AI chips. That explanation was credible and important. A cloud and AI business cut off from stable access to the highest-end compute components faces a different growth path and a different valuation profile. But the cancellation also revealed that restructuring logic can collapse when geopolitics intrude. Freshipo's IPO was put on hold. Then, in March 2024, Alibaba withdrew Cainiao's planned listing and moved to buy out minority shareholders for up to $3.75 billion. Officially, Alibaba emphasized Cainiao's strategic importance. Zhou Sai also pointed to weak capital market conditions and valuation mismatches. That, too, was likely true. But it also underscored the core contradiction. Some businesses looked independent only until Alibaba was forced to decide whether it truly wanted to let them drift away from the center. Thus, the Great Unraveling was not a complete failure, but it was a partial retreat from the initial bravado. The reorganization succeeded as a managerial and psychological reset. It clarified accountability, enabled leadership reshuffles, and created room to think in terms of business group economics rather than one giant, undifferentiated empire. But it did not fully succeed as a listing machine that would cleanly unlock value across the conglomerate. What remained by 2024 was less the dream of 6 flourishing public cousins and more the residue of a forced strategic sorting. The businesses that most clearly mattered, domestic commerce and cloud, began to pull power back toward the center. The businesses once imagined as candidates for outside monetization were judged more pragmatically by strategic necessity and market conditions. In this sense, 1 + 6 + n did not vanish. It evolved from an almost celebratory decentralization thesis into a harsher instrument for identifying what Alibaba was truly willing to prioritize. Corporate structures are diagrams of power, but storms are survived by people, not diagrams. That made leadership change the next crucial chapter. In June 2023, Alibaba announced a succession plan that would have looked, in calmer times, like a carefully managed transition into the next generation of stewardship. Joseph Tsai, long the company's financial and institutional strategist, would become chairman. Eddie Yongming Wu, a co-founder with deep technical and product roots in Taobao, Alipay, and Alimama, would become group CEO. Daniel Zhang, who had led Alibaba through Singles Day's rise, through the long handoff from Jack Ma, through the pandemic, and through the early phase of the crackdown, would concentrate on leading the Cloud Intelligence Group as it moved toward an expected spin-off. The official language emphasized continuity and strategic fit. Zhang was described as the right leader for cloud in the generative AI era. Tsai and Wu brought long internal legitimacy. The logic held together on paper, yet the transition unfolded in a more unstable way than intended. On September 10, 2023, the same day the top leadership transition formally took effect, Alibaba disclosed that Daniel Zhang would no longer lead the cloud business after all. The company instead put Eddie Wu in charge of both the group and cloud. Zhang would establish a technology fund with Alibaba's support. For outside observers, the abruptness of the shift raised inevitable questions. Was cloud really the destination Zhang had chosen? Or had cloud become too strategic, too uncertain, and too politically sensitive to leave outside the direct command of the new core leadership? Whatever the internal answer, the effect was clear. Power consolidated fast around the circle most historically associated with Alibaba's founding logic. Tsai held the chair, Wu ran the group. Then in December 2023, Wu also took direct control of Taobao and Tmall Group, giving him day-to-day authority over Alibaba's 2 most important engines, domestic e-commerce and cloud. Reuters correctly described this as a consolidation of control over core businesses. It also signaled the limits of diffuse management after a period of trauma. When a company is fighting regulatory overhang, market share pressure, and a strategic pivot to AI all at once, collective ambiguity becomes a luxury. This is where the return of founders must be understood carefully. Jack Ma did not come back as a formal executive commander. The post-2020 environment made that almost impossible. Instead, the founder return happened through personnel lineages, internal legitimacy, and symbolic intervention. Tsai and Wu were both co-founders and longtime lieutenants. Their authority was not borrowed from investor relations language. It came from deep historical embeddedness in the company's formative systems. Then, in April 2024, Ma himself surfaced in a rare internal message praising the restructuring and urging the company to continue becoming more agile and customer-focused. He reportedly acknowledged that Alibaba had made many mistakes in the past. That line mattered because it represented something close to founder-sanctioned humility, a very different register from the performative confidence of the Bund speech years earlier. The personnel story at Echo had some of these themes.
In January 2023, Jack Ma relinquished control of Ant Group through governance adjustments that reduced his voting influence and ended the previous pattern of effective founder control. The move was widely read as part of the effort to draw a line under the crackdown. It also fit a broader post-2020 principle. High-profile concentration of personal influence had become a liability, not an asset. Then, in 2024, Ant undertook its biggest internal shakeup since the regulatory overhaul, appointing Han Xingyi as president and giving units such as Ant International, Ocean Base, and Ant Digital Technologies more independent governance structures. Even here, the pattern was familiar: modularization, formalization, and less reliance on charismatic founder-era control. Leadership in Flux also reflected competing interpretations of what Alibaba needed most. Daniel Zhang represented, in many ways, managerial continuity and the long evolution from scaled commerce company into a more professionalized conglomerate. Wu represented technical roots, product instinct, and a sharper appetite for focused execution. Tsai represented capital discipline, governance, and external credibility. The combination of Tsai and Wu made sense for a company trying to simplify itself, allocate capital more rigorously, and reassert command over core operations. There is also a harsher way to put it. The old Alibaba had enough momentum and enough ambient trust to tolerate a more distributed internal politics. The post-crackdown Alibaba did not. It needed leaders who could make hard choices quickly, who carried founder-level legitimacy without the liabilities attached to Ma's public profile, and who were willing to say, in effect, that some cherished pieces of the empire would no longer be funded, floated, or protected simply because they were interesting. This helps explain why leadership change and strategic focus reinforced each other. Wu's public language in 2024 was direct. The top priority was to reignite growth in the core businesses of e-commerce and cloud computing. That is not the language of a company intoxicated by option value across dozens of adjacencies. It is the language of a company that has learned, painfully, the cost of drift. In the end, the leadership story was not about palace drama. It was about the selection of the kind of authority Alibaba thought could survive the new era. Formal charisma receded. Technical and founder-adjacent operators advanced, the center narrowed, and through internal signals more than public spectacle, Jack Ma shifted from being the emblem of unconstrained expansion to a quieter patron of disciplined reinvention. By 2024, Alibaba had begun to describe itself in language that would have sounded almost minimalist by the standards of its earlier empire-building years. In the fiscal 2024 annual report, Zhou Tsai and Eddie Wu wrote that Alibaba had two core businesses, e-commerce and cloud computing. That line was more than investor messaging. It was the distilled philosophy of the post-storm company. Why these two? Because together they offered both continuity and future leverage. E-commerce remained Alibaba's historical base, the terrain where its brands, merchant relationships, logistics integration, user traffic, and monetization machinery still mattered at enormous scale. Cloud, meanwhile, represented not just enterprise infrastructure, but the platform on which Alibaba could plausibly claim strategic relevance in the age of artificial intelligence. Every other business now had to justify itself either as a support to these engines or as a disciplined asset worth owning on its own terms. The renewed focus on core commerce came from necessity. Taobao and Tmall were still China's largest domestic e-commerce platforms, but they were no longer untouchable. Pinduoduo had altered consumer expectations around price and value. Douyin had shown how entertainment-led discovery could eat into shopping time and merchant budgets. China's weaker macro environment after the pandemic also made consumers more price-sensitive.
Inside Alibaba, executives openly described the competitive context as a battle over value for money. This was not the market that had once rewarded incumbency by default. So, the new strategy put the user first in a more operational sense. Alibaba said it would invest in improving core user experiences, platform competitiveness, and merchant economics. That meant better matching, better service, better supply, and fewer distractions from lines of business that could not contribute to the main contest. The point was not to abandon ecosystem thinking entirely. China, for example, still mattered because logistics quality affects commerce quality. Local services could still reinforce user frequency. But the hierarchy had changed. Adjacencies were no longer the story. They were supporting cast. Cloud and AI became the other half of the new Alibaba. In April 2023, Alibaba Cloud introduced Tongyi Chen-wen, later known internationally through the Qwen family of models, and stated that the model would be integrated across Alibaba's businesses, from enterprise collaboration to smart devices, e-commerce, search, navigation, and entertainment. This was a notable shift. In the earlier era, cloud had often been justified as the industrial internet counterpart to Alibaba's consumer internet strengths. In the post-2022 AI wave, cloud suddenly had a second destiny. It was the computational substrate for model training, deployment, and AI services, while AI itself promised to improve both enterprise products and consumer experiences. By fiscal 2024, Alibaba's letters and earnings commentary made that relationship explicit. Public cloud growth and AI-related product revenue became markers of strategic progress. The company argued that AI was not just a fashionable add-on, but the force that could transform internal operations, consumer experiences, and cloud demand all at once. In August 2024, Alibaba reported that AI-related product revenue continued to grow at triple-digit rates year over year. That figure, while not a complete answer to the company's broader commercial challenges, helped provide a new narrative spine. Alibaba could be the company that married mass-scale commerce with national-scale cloud and an increasingly credible AI stack. Capital allocation changed accordingly. Alibaba emphasized that in fiscal 2024, it did not put money into new business lines. Instead, it returned substantial cash to shareholders through its first annual dividend and large share repurchases, while reserving investment for two areas: accelerating the growth of core businesses and maintaining leadership in fundamental technologies and innovation, including AI. That combination is telling. Mature empires often try to preserve prestige by continuing to fund every promising adjacent frontier. Post-storm, Alibaba did the opposite. It said, in effect, "We will be choosy, and our choices will reveal who we now think we are." Even the businesses that remained under the umbrella were reinterpreted through this lens. Cainiao's withdrawn IPO in 2024 was not framed as surrender, but as recognition of strategic importance. Its value was no longer purely the value that public markets might assign to a logistics stock. It was the value of being part of the commerce machine Alibaba needed to defend. The same logic applied, with different degrees of force, to other assets. The company's future would not be defined by how many separately narratable businesses it possessed. It would be defined by whether the whole portfolio increased the quality, defensibility, and growth of the core. This new identity was also more politically legible. A company focused on commerce infrastructure, cloud services, AI capability, and disciplined capital management is easier to explain to regulators, investors, and the public than a sprawling empire constantly pushing into sensitive new territory. The post-crackdown Alibaba therefore did not simply become narrower because it was weaker, it became narrower because narrowness itself had become a strategic virtue. That does not mean the problems vanished. Revenue growth remained well below the glory years. Competition in commerce stayed intense. The cloud spin-off's failure showed how geopolitical technology constraints could still disrupt plans. and the company's share price remained far below the heights it once enjoyed. But the shape of the company had changed. It was no longer trying to prove that everything connected to Alibaba should belong to Alibaba. It was trying to prove that under new rules, it could still dominate the domains that mattered most. The new Alibaba, then, was not a return to innocence. It was a post-trauma organism, more self-conscious, more disciplined, and more explicit about its hierarchy of priorities. The age of effortless ecosystem expansion had ended. In its place came a harsher formula: core commerce for cash flow and user reach, cloud for infrastructure and strategic relevance, AI for renewal. Everything else had to earn its place in relation to those pillars. Between 2020 and 2024, Alibaba did not merely endure regulation, it was remade by it. The halting of Ant's IPO shattered the mythology of unstoppable founder-era ascent. The antitrust fine dismantled the complacency around marketplace dominance. Data, algorithm, and cybersecurity scrutiny widened the field of control. Ant's restructuring showed that the Chinese state was willing to press deeply into the architecture of finance data power. Alibaba's own reorganization, leadership changes, and capital shifts revealed a company struggling first to preserve optionality, then to rediscover necessity. The most important outcome of the storm was conceptual. Before 2020, Alibaba's master idea was expansion through adjacency.
After 2020, its master idea became legitimacy through focus. That is a profound difference. The old company asked how many reinforcing systems it could build around digital commerce. The new company asked which systems are core enough to defend, compliant enough to justify, and strategically important enough to merit long-term investment. That is why the period should not be read as a simple collapse or a simple recovery. It was a transition from one governing logic to another. The end state was smaller in ambition at the edges, but sharper at the center. Alibaba emerged less as a private empire claiming the future by scale alone, and more as a disciplined infrastructure company trying to win a narrower set of battles: commerce, cloud, and AI. Whether that new formula proves as durable as the old one remains an open question, but by 2024, the direction was unmistakable. The storm had stripped away illusion, and what remained was the core. Part 7. Alibaba's Horizon. AI, Global Competition, and Future Growth, 2024 to 2026. Alibaba entered 2024 with a strange combination of exhaustion and possibility. It was still carrying the bruises of the regulatory era, still living with the aftershocks of the 2023 restructuring, and still explaining why a company that had once seemed almost synonymous with Chinese internet dominance now needed a comeback script at all. But that was precisely the point. By the start of 2024, management had stopped speaking as if Alibaba needed 1,000 ambitions. It began speaking as if it needed 2. One was commerce, the other was artificial intelligence married to cloud infrastructure. Everything else, from capital allocation to organization design to overseas expansion, would increasingly be judged by whether it strengthened one of those 2 engines. That narrowing of purpose mattered because the previous Alibaba had become sprawling enough to confuse even sympathetic investors. The company had marketplace businesses, logistics, local services, international platforms, entertainment assets, offline retail experiments, and a cloud arm that had at one point been set up for a possible spin-off before U.S. chip controls forced a retreat. In late 2023, the cloud spin-off was shelved because export restrictions had injected too much uncertainty into the economics and strategic autonomy of the business. So 2024 did not begin as a clean victory lap. It began as a reset after an aborted separation. Alibaba was being forced to accept a harder truth. In the AI era, cloud could not be treated like a detachable financial asset. It was becoming the power plant. In February 2024, the first visible sign of the new posture came not in a model launch, but in capital markets.
Alibaba expanded its share repurchase program by another $25 billion and extended it through March 2027. The move was partly financial engineering, partly theater, and partly a statement of confidence. Management wanted investors to believe that the company was undervalued, yes, but also that the company still had the firepower to fight on multiple fronts at once. Eddie Wu, who had taken over as group chief executive and also assumed direct control over key commerce units, framed the priority with unusual bluntness. Alibaba's top task, he said in effect, was to reignite the growth of its core businesses, e-commerce and cloud computing. That line became the drumbeat for the next 2 years. The philosophical foundation was laid out more fully in the company's 2024 shareholder letter. Joe Tsai and Eddie Wu described Alibaba as a company that had accumulated some of the habits of a large bureaucracy and now needed to recover the temperament of a startup. Their first strategic idea was user first. Their second was the conviction that AI would not sit at the edge of the business as a clever tool, but would become both a new growth engine and a force that rewired the experience of commerce itself. They spoke openly about artificial general intelligence as a long-range horizon, and just as importantly, they explained why they thought Alibaba had a special position in that race. A company with large cash flows from commerce could afford model training and infrastructure investment. A company with a cloud platform could monetize demand for those models. A company with sprawling consumer surfaces could then apply those models back into real products. That is what made the 2024 pivot more interesting than a routine corporate AI slogan. Alibaba was not merely saying, like so many incumbents, that it would use AI. It was arguing that commerce, cloud, and frontier models could form a loop. Better models create demand for compute. Compute demand strengthens the cloud business. A stronger cloud business funds more model development. Better models then improve shopping, search, ads, logistics, service, and merchant tooling.
The company's vision was less AI as a feature than AI as a flywheel wrapped around an old marketplace empire. The rest of the period from 2024 into early 2026 can be read as Alibaba trying to make that loop real before rivals made it irrelevant. The user-first doctrine, which sounds bland in corporate English, had a very specific edge inside Alibaba's domestic battlegrounds. For much of the platform economy's maturing phase, Alibaba had lived off the fact that merchants needed access to its traffic, its storefront tools, and its enormous base of consumers. But by 2024, that relationship was no longer enough. If lower income and mass affluent consumers were both hunting harder for value, and if brands were reallocating budget toward content-led discovery on Douyin, then Alibaba had to repair the consumer side of the equation rather than merely optimizing monetization for merchants. That is why management kept stressing attractive prices, service quality, and repeat purchase behavior. The company understood that without durable user love, marketplace monetization becomes a tax on a decaying city. This helps explain why some of Alibaba's actions in 2024 and 2025 looked contradictory on the surface. On one hand, it was investing in loyalty programs, canceling or rebating fees, supporting merchants with AI tools, and sacrificing near-term cash flow to improve the ecosystem. On the other hand, it was also trying to lift take rates and expand customer management revenue. The apparent contradiction was actually a sequence. First, rebuild traffic quality, trust, and order growth. Then, monetize a healthier flow with better ad products, smarter merchant tools, software as a service fees, and a more engaged premium cohort. The company's AI-powered marketing tool, Quanzhen Tui, fits exactly into that pattern. It let Alibaba present monetization not as extraction, but as a performance service with clearer return on investment for merchants. Whether merchants fully agreed is another matter, but the logic was internally coherent. The premium cohort itself was one of Alibaba's underappreciated defensive moats in this period. 88 VIP was not just a membership count to be recited on earnings calls. It was a signal that Alibaba still had leverage over China's highest-spending digital consumers. Those users matter disproportionately because they are attractive to brands, more likely to buy repeatedly, and more likely to cross categories inside an ecosystem if the experience is convenient enough.
By moving from roughly 42 million members in mid-2024 to more than 50 million by spring 2025, and then higher still later that year, Alibaba showed that even in a more fragmented internet environment, it could still concentrate premium demand. That does not neutralize PDD's power in value-focused commerce, but it does preserve a part of the market where Taobao and Tmall remain structurally valuable. Cloud competition, meanwhile, had its own anatomy. Alibaba was the incumbent, but incumbency in cloud can become awkward when the market is being reborn around generative AI. Legacy enterprise contracts, lower margin project work, and a broad installed base are not enough if AI developers care intensely about GPU availability, networking performance, container orchestration, inference economics, and access to cutting-edge models. Reuters reporting on Alibaba Cloud's sharp price cuts in 2024 captured the most visible symptom of that new environment, but the deeper issue was strategic. Alibaba had to become the preferred venue for training, fine-tuning, and deploying AI workloads without destroying the economics of the business. Every cloud provider wants developers. In an AI race, providers also need to prevent rivals from capturing the whole surrounding ecosystem of tooling and mindshare. This is where Alibaba's full-stack narrative gained force. By 2025, Zhou was explicitly contrasting Alibaba's approach with that of companies that only built models or only sold infrastructure. Alibaba's claim was that value in AI would not settle permanently at one layer. Some gains would accrue to infrastructure providers, some to model builders, some to application companies, and some to platforms that could orchestrate all three. If that claim is right, then Alibaba's structure is an advantage. If it is wrong, then Alibaba risks spending heavily across the stack without owning the most profitable layer. That uncertainty sits at the center of the investment case. The company is effectively wagering that integration beats specialization in a formative technology cycle. It may be right, but it is not a trivial wager. The problem, of course, was that the competitive clock was already ticking. In domestic e-commerce, Alibaba was no longer the uncontested gravity well it had once been. PDD had proven that consumers under economic stress could be mobilized around aggressive value and discount psychology.
JD remained powerful in electronics, appliances, fulfillment, and trust. Douyin was diverting both attention and advertising budgets through live commerce and content-led discovery. In cloud, Alibaba still had scale, but Chinese rivals and upstarts were pressing on price, and the generative AI boom was making compute customers more expensive to win. So the company's answer in 2024 was not a single heroic swing. It was a bundle of coordinated moves: improve user experience, cut friction for merchants, lower cloud prices, release better models, invest abroad, and prune anything that no longer strengthened the core. The cloud piece became visible almost immediately. In February 2024, Reuters reported that Alibaba Cloud would slash prices on some cloud products by as much as 55%, its sharpest price cut to date, as competition intensified for large users and especially for AI developers. A little more than a month later, Reuters reported another round of cuts, this time on services powered by offshore data centers, with reductions reaching as high as 59%. These were not the actions of a complacent market leader calmly harvesting margins. They were the actions of a company digging trenches before a war became total. In China's AI market, price was beginning to behave like a weapon, and Alibaba was signaling that it would not defend leadership with prestige alone. Then came the model side. In June 2024, Alibaba announced Q2, a refreshed family of open models ranging from small parameter counts up through a 72 billion parameter model plus a mixture of experts variant. The company emphasized improved multilingual performance, longer context windows, better alignment, and more efficient inference. Q2 quickly rose to the top of open model rankings on Hugging Face's leaderboard, which gave Alibaba something strategically precious: evidence that its open source posture could be a source of prestige rather than merely a concession. The point was not just to impress benchmark watchers, it was to make Alibaba Cloud the natural place for developers and enterprises who wanted to build on a powerful Chinese origin model ecosystem without paying the tolls of a closed garden.
This open strategy deserves emphasis because it became one of Alibaba's defining choices in the period. The company kept releasing stronger proprietary capabilities, but it also treated openness as a distribution system. QWEN models were made available on ModelScope, Alibaba's own model community, and spread across the wider global open source ecosystem. In effect, Alibaba was wagering that a model family could create demand beyond direct licensing. If thousands of developers, researchers, and companies built on QWEN, they would also need tools, orchestration, hosting, inference, optimization, and data infrastructure. Josai later described this as a full-stack strategy. The model could be open, the monetization could happen elsewhere in the stack. That logic would become even more central once DeepSeek shocked the market in 2025. By the summer of 2024, Alibaba began to show early operational proof that the strategy was not entirely imaginary. In the quarter ended June 30, 2024, group revenue rose 4% year-over-year to 243.24 billion renminbi. That was not dazzling by the standards of Alibaba's imperial phase, but it mattered because the mix was telling. Cloud revenue rose 6% to 26.55 billion renminbi, with public cloud and AI-related products driving a return to positive growth in revenue, excluding Alibaba consolidated subsidiaries. AI-related product revenue grew at a triple-digit pace. The number of paying users on Alibaba Cloud's AI platform jumped by more than 200% quarter-over-quarter. International commerce revenue rose 32%. Meanwhile, management said investments to improve user experience on Taobao and Tmall were lifting repeat purchasing and stabilizing market share. Those commerce investments were more practical than glamorous. Taobao and Tmall simplified the 6.18 mid-year shopping festival, abandoning the older Cree-sale choreography in favor of a cleaner two-wave format. They used more AI-powered tools to answer product questions, help with price comparisons, and improve merchant operations. They pushed harder on the 88 VIP ecosystem, the premium membership layer that functions as both a high-value consumer cluster and a mechanism for binding users more tightly to Alibaba's universe. By the June 2024 quarter, 88 VIP membership had passed 42 million and was still growing at a double-digit pace. In an environment where Chinese consumption was uneven and price sensitivity was rising, Alibaba's answer was not simply to subsidize more. It was to make the platform feel more useful, more frictionless, and more rewarding to come back to. At the same time, the international side of the company was growing into a more serious story. Alibaba International Digital Commerce Group, or AIDC, was no longer a decorative collection of overseas bets. It was one of the fastest-growing major segments inside the company. AliExpress's Choice service was driving order growth. Trendyol was extending into the Gulf region. Lazada was narrowing losses. Cainiao's cross-border logistics capabilities were being woven more tightly into AliExpress and the broader international commerce operation. In Brazil, Alibaba announced a partnership with Magazine Luiza, one of the country's largest retailers, to distribute Choice products through Magalu's channels. In Europe, AliExpress became the exclusive e-commerce partner of UEFA Euro 2024 and enlisted David Beckham as an ambassador. These were not just marketing fireworks. They were signs that Alibaba wanted its international expansion to be understood as a brand-building and logistics coordination exercise, not merely a spillover of cheap Chinese supply. There was also a symbolic international showcase in 2024 that fit neatly with the company's AI cloud narrative, the Paris Olympics. Alibaba Cloud said that for the first time, cloud transmission overtook satellites as the primary means of broadcast for the games, with about 2/3 of rights-holding broadcasters using live signals transmitted through its cloud systems. Alibaba also highlighted AI use cases around archival restoration and real-time immersive replays. Strictly speaking, the Olympics did not transform Alibaba's economics, but strategically, they were useful theater. They allowed the company to present itself not simply as China's biggest online mall operator experimenting with AI, but as a global digital infrastructure provider handling mission-critical media workflows at planetary scale. If the first half of 2024 was about early proof, the second half was about clearing the deck and tightening the machine. In August 2024, China's market regulator said Alibaba had completed its 3-year rectification period, the long shadow cast by the record antitrust fine of 2021. Shortly afterward, Reuters also reported that Alibaba's apps had completed key data compliance procedures under China's rules for personal information collection and usage. Neither development erased the memory of the crackdown years, but together they mattered. The company was no longer trying to grow while carrying unresolved regulatory probation in plain sight. The message from Beijing was not anything goes, but it was clearly less punitive than the era that had brought Ant Group's IPO to a halt and driven Alibaba's valuation off a cliff. The shackles were not gone, but they were looser. Yet the easing of formal regulatory pressure did not mean the market itself had become friendlier. In fact, 2024 made clear that Alibaba had traded one kind of pain for another. Politics had become less suffocating just as competition had become more Darwinian. Reuters captured the problem in several pieces that year. Chinese consumers remained cautious, brands were shifting spend toward platforms like Douyin, and platforms across the sector were being singed by an ongoing price war. PDD, in particular, had changed the emotional weather of Chinese e-commerce. It trained shoppers to think in terms of ruthless value extraction. That did not make Taobao or Tmall obsolete, but it did mean Alibaba had to prove that a giant incumbent could still win on user experience while also defending price competitiveness. That is a much harder trick than merely being big. The September 2024 quarter showed both the promise and the strain. Revenue rose 5% year-over-year to 236.5 billion renminbi. Cloud growth accelerated to 7%, reaching 29.6 billion renminbi. International commerce rose 29% to 31.7 billion renminbi. 88 VIP membership reached 46 million. Taobao and Tmall recorded online gross merchandise value growth and double-digit order growth. But free cash flow and cash balances were under pressure because Alibaba was spending on cloud infrastructure and supporting merchants more aggressively. For example, it canceled the annual service fee for Tmall merchants and offered rebates for smaller sellers. In the short run, that depressed monetization. In the long run, Alibaba was betting that a healthier merchant ecosystem would be worth more than squeezing a tired one. The AI layer also advanced in this period. At the 2024 Apsara conference in September, Alibaba Cloud unveiled Q2.5, more infrastructure enhancements and lower API prices designed to make the models easier to use at scale. The company wanted the market to see not just a clever model lab, but a vertically integrated industrial platform. In a world where enterprises were trying to decide which AI ecosystems were likely to survive the current frenzy, Alibaba's answer was to make itself look inevitable. A cloud, a model family, tooling, applications, and distribution all bundled together. Then, in November 2024, came one of the period's most important organizational decisions. Alibaba formed a new e-commerce business group under Zhang Fan that brought together Taobao, Tmall, AliExpress, Alibaba.com, Lazada, Trendyol, 1688, and Idlefish. This was not a cosmetic shuffle. It was the clearest acknowledgement yet that domestic and international commerce could no longer be run as semi-independent kingdoms if the company wanted to compete on supply chains, logistics, merchant services, and AI-enhanced operations. Eddie Wu described e-commerce and AI technology as Alibaba's two most strategically important directions. Read plainly, that meant the company had stopped pretending that the old portfolio itself was the strategy. The strategy was now the concentration of energy. The integration also reflected a subtle shift in how Alibaba understood globalization. For years, its overseas efforts could be described as expansion by adjacency. Buy or build local platforms, add logistics where possible, and hope scale follows. By late 2024, the idea was more disciplined. Globalization was not only about collecting foreign consumers, it was about connecting Chinese merchants, overseas local supply, cross-border logistics, and data infrastructure into one operating system. That is why the 2024 integration placed so much emphasis on global supply chain synergies. Alibaba was trying to behave less like a holding company with many flags and more like a single commercial machine whose parts happened to serve different geographies. December 2024 supplied the first unmistakable evidence that recalibration meant sacrifice. Reuters reported that Alibaba agreed to sell InTime, the department store chain it had taken private as part of its earlier new retail vision, for roughly $1.02 billion, booking about a $1.3 billion loss. A few weeks later, it announced the sale of its majority stake in Sun Art, another major offline retail asset, for about $1.58 billion, also at a steep loss compared with the ambitions that had once justified the investment. Seen purely through accounting, these were painful retreats. Seen strategically, they were confessions. The grand idea that Alibaba would deeply fuse online dominance with a powerful portfolio of brick-and-mortar retail assets had not become the future-defining engine it was once advertised to be. The company was now choosing to bleed in order to become lighter. At nearly the same moment, Alibaba made another international move that pointed in a different direction. In South Korea, AliExpress Korea and Shinsegae's Gmarket were brought into a joint venture plan announced in late 2024. The two platforms were to continue operating independently, but the arrangement signaled that Alibaba no longer saw overseas growth as purely a matter of shipping goods into markets from China. In some regions, especially sophisticated consumer markets with strong local incumbents and political sensitivities, partnership and localized structure were likely to be more durable than brute force entry. The South Korea effort would later run into regulatory conditions, which only underscored the point. International growth had become more political, more negotiated, and less simple than the earlier internet playbook had assumed. Then, just as Alibaba seemed to be settling into its 2024 rhythm, the AI race in China changed temperature dramatically. In January 2025, DeepSeek V3 and then R1 captured enormous attention for combining strong performance with startlingly efficient cost claims. The shock was not merely technical, it was psychological. It suggested that a leaner, more focused Chinese lab could embarrass giant platforms that were spending billions and employing armies. Reuters noted the significance of what happened next. On the first day of Lunar New Year, when much of China was off work, Alibaba rushed out Q1 2.5 Max and claimed it surpassed DeepSeek V3 as well as leading Western models on several benchmarks. The holiday timing was revealing. Alibaba was not moving like a complacent incumbent. It was moving like a company that had just heard footsteps behind it. This was the first major test of Alibaba's AI identity under real pressure. DeepSeek had done what true challengers do. It changed the frame. Suddenly, the question was not whether Alibaba had a competent model program. The question was whether Alibaba could innovate fast enough, cheaply enough, and boldly enough to avoid being trapped between global leaders above it and insurgent Chinese labs below it. The company's answer was to accelerate everywhere at once. It kept advancing the open source family. It leaned harder into infrastructure. It pushed new consumer distribution for its models, and it began speaking even more openly about AGI, not because AGI itself was near, but because invoking that horizon helped justify a scale of spending that would otherwise seem extravagant. In February 2025, Alibaba also scored an important symbolic victory outside the benchmark wars. Joseph Chai confirmed that Alibaba would partner with Apple to support AI features on iPhones sold in China. This mattered for several reasons. First, it validated Alibaba as a trusted domestic AI partner at a moment when Apple needed a local solution that could satisfy Chinese regulatory requirements. Second, it gave Alibaba a brand association that mattered to investors and enterprise customers alike. Third, it suggested that Alibaba's AI effort could generate demand not only through its own apps and cloud platform, but also through alliances with global hardware ecosystems. Reuters rightly described it as a major win in China's AI market. The December 2024 quarter results, reported in February 2025, helped turn that momentum into numbers. Group revenue rose 8% year-over-year to 280.15 billion renminbi, the fastest top-line growth Alibaba had posted in more than a year. Cloud revenue rose 13% to 31.74 billion renminbi, with AI-related products delivering triple-digit growth for a sixth consecutive quarter. International commerce revenue rose 32%, with AliExpress and Trendyol again supplying much of the energy. 88 VIP membership climbed to 49 million. Management highlighted more than 90,000 derivative models built on QN since the family's first open release in 2023, evidence that the open source bet was creating a real ecosystem rather than an academic ornament. But the most striking remarks from that earnings cycle were philosophical. Eddie Wu described AGI as Alibaba's primary objective. He likened AI to the electricity of the future and cloud computing to the grid that would distribute it. The metaphor was ambitious to the point of audacity, but it reveals how management wanted the company to be understood. Alibaba was not trying to be just one app, one model, or one marketplace among many. It wanted to be a utility-like layer for the next industrial cycle, while also owning a giant consumption surface through which AI-driven services could be deployed directly. It was an attempt to marry the old marketplace empire to a new infrastructure empire before anyone forced a divorce. 4 days after those results, Alibaba made the largest explicit capital commitment of the whole period. It said it would invest at least 380 billion renminbi, roughly $53 billion, in cloud computing and AI infrastructure over the next 3 years. Reuters noted that this exceeded Alibaba's total cloud and AI investment over the prior decade. The number mattered less as a precise budget than as a declaration of intent. It told the market that Alibaba had decided not to ration its future. The company understood that the danger in the AI era was not merely spending too much, it was spending too little and waking up to discover that the platforms with the deepest compute, the broadest model ecosystem, and the strongest developer mindshare had already locked in the field. That same month, Alibaba Cloud open-sourced WAN 2.1, a family of video generation models, extending the company's open approach beyond text into multimodal media creation. The release reinforced 2 themes. First, Alibaba wanted the QN and WAN ecosystems to become broad creative and enterprise toolkits rather than a single flagship chatbot. Second, the company was treating openness as geopolitical and commercial strategy. By making high-quality models widely downloadable, it could reach developers, researchers, and startups around the world, even where Alibaba-branded consumer products or regulated cloud services might face friction. In an era of geopolitical mistrust, open-source distribution became a kind of soft power. Spring 2025 brought another important milestone. In April, Alibaba launched QN3, introducing hybrid reasoning models that could switch between a fast, non-thinking mode and a more deliberate reasoning mode for harder tasks. The company highlighted support for 119 languages and dialects, stronger agent capabilities, improved tool use, and a much larger training corpus than the previous generation. More than a simple model bump, QN3 suggested that Alibaba had absorbed the lesson of the post-DeepSeek moment. The company was not going to rely on the old bragging rights of scale alone. It wanted to show flexibility, efficiency, and architecture choices tailored to the way the market was evolving. Reasoning, agent behavior, and cost performance were becoming the new battlegrounds. When Alibaba reported results for the quarter ended March 31, 2025, the larger pattern was becoming hard to miss. Group revenue rose 7% year-over-year, cloud revenue rose 18%, and AI-related products achieved triple-digit growth for a seventh straight quarter. Customer management revenue in Taobao and Tmall rose 12%, helped by improved take rate, merchant tools, and better monetization. International commerce revenue grew 22%. The company returned $16.5 billion to shareholders in fiscal 2025 through dividends and repurchases. But what mattered more strategically was how it described the year. Management said the user-first, AI-driven strategy was working and increasingly spoke of e-commerce and AI plus cloud as twin engines rather than unrelated businesses. The June 2025 annual letter sharpened the picture. Tsai and Wu wrote that fiscal 2025 had been a year of solid progress under the user-first, AI-driven framework. They described e-commerce and AI plus cloud as the two core businesses powering long-term growth. They also made explicit that the portfolio was being streamlined to support that goal, citing the divestitures of Sun Art and InTime. This is one of the clearest windows into how Alibaba's leadership saw the company's identity changing. The old logic of owning many optionalities had given way to a harder doctrine. If a business was not strengthening commerce or AI cloud, it was a candidate for monetization, integration, or neglect. The annual letter also offered one of the most important snapshots of Alibaba's AI progress by mid-2025. By the end of April 2025, the company said it had open-sourced more than 200 QN models, generating over 300 million downloads and more than 100,000 derivative models. It described QN as the world's largest open-source model family. Those are company-characterized achievements, so one should treat the rhetoric with appropriate caution. Yet even allowing for the self-interested framing, the broader fact is undeniable. Alibaba had succeeded in turning open-source AI into one of the central pillars of its brand. That mattered because it differentiated Alibaba from domestic rivals leaning more heavily on proprietary consumer apps and from global giants whose ecosystems were more closed. Meanwhile, the international business was becoming more disciplined. In the same letter, management said AIDC had delivered robust growth driven by cross-border commerce, and operating efficiency had improved enough for the company to believe an international commerce profit quarter was within reach in the coming fiscal year. That was a subtle but important evolution. For years, many investors treated overseas commerce as a perpetual investment story, always growing, always losing money, always promising eventual leverage. By 2025, Alibaba was trying to show that globalization could be a business rather than just a boast. AliExpress, Trendyol, and related operations were increasingly framed not only as growth vehicles, but as candidates for real operating discipline. The cloud globalization story also deepened in 2025. Alibaba Cloud expanded its international data center footprint, announcing new capacity in Southeast Asia and later broader plans for first data centers in Brazil, France, and the Netherlands, with additional expansion slated for markets including Mexico, Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, and Dubai. By Alibaba Cloud's own global locations materials, the network reached 94 availability zones across 29 regions. None of this meant Alibaba was suddenly rivaling the full international reach of Amazon, Microsoft, or Google. It did mean that Alibaba was building enough overseas infrastructure to become a more serious partner for Chinese companies going abroad, regional enterprises in Asia and the Middle East, and developers seeking an alternative cloud stack tied to QN. That distinction is important. Alibaba's most realistic version of globalization in this period was not beat AWS everywhere, it was become indispensable wherever Chinese commercial ecosystems, Asian digital demand, and open-source AI adoption overlap. That is a narrower but still substantial ambition. It explains why the company emphasized support for the globalization of Chinese enterprises, why it kept investing in Southeast Asia and the Gulf, and why it treated cloud expansion, cross-border logistics, and open-source model distribution as related pieces of one puzzle. Alibaba was searching for the corridors where its identity as a Chinese platform was an advantage rather than a handicap. By mid to late 2025, however, it was becoming clear that the company would have to fight on brutally expensive ground at home while navigating murkier ground abroad. Domestically, e-commerce competition did not cool, it mutated. Reuters reported in May 2025 that Alibaba and JD had opened a new front in instant retail, racing to offer 30 to 60-minute delivery and trying to capture more of consumers' everyday, high-frequency spending.
That battle matters because it reveals Alibaba's updated view of commerce. The company no longer wanted to be thought of purely as the place where people came for planned purchases and festival sales. It wanted to absorb more of daily life: food, urgent needs, local delivery, travel, and recurring consumption. This is the background to Taobao Instant Commerce and the later creation of the China e-commerce group that combined Taobao and Tmall with Ella.me and Fliggy. In late April 2025, Alibaba launched Taobao Instant Commerce and later committed 50 billion renminbi to support that push. By August 2025, management said the service had materially increased user engagement and contributed to a 25% year-over-year increase in monthly active consumers on the Taobao app in the first 3 weeks of August. The logic was elegant even if the economics were rough. High-frequency delivery changes app behavior. If users open Taobao not only for occasional shopping, but for everyday needs, the app becomes stickier, richer in data, and more defensible against attention competitors. The cost is that fast fulfillment and subsidy wars can devour margin like a furnace devours wood. Alibaba accepted that trade. In August 2025, the company said it remained committed to investing in its two strategic pillars, consumption and AI plus cloud, even if that meant significant near-term spending. Like-for-like revenue growth, excluding divested assets, looked much healthier than headline growth. Cloud revenue had accelerated to 34% growth in the June 2025 quarter, with revenue from external customers up 29%. AI-related product revenue posted its 9th consecutive triple-digit growth. Management said around 120 billion renminbi in capital expenditure had been deployed over the previous 4 quarters to advance AI and cloud infrastructure. This was not merely a story of clever models. It was the old, heavy, physical truth of the AI era: racks, chips, networking, power, and data centers. At the same time, the consumer-facing AI story was getting more concrete. Alibaba launched the Qwen app in public beta, positioning it as a broader productivity and agentic assistant rather than just a chat toy. Official company materials said it passed 10 million downloads within the first week. Quark, another Alibaba consumer product, was increasingly described as an AI super assistant. Inside the company's logic, this was the missing bridge between model prestige and consumer relevance. It was not enough to be known for open-source models among developers. Alibaba needed AI products that ordinary users would actually touch. Otherwise, rivals like ByteDance could dominate the consumer mindshare layer, while Alibaba remained the respectable infrastructure provider in the basement. That consumer AI battle intensified dramatically around the 2026 Lunar New Year. Reuters reported that ByteDance's Doubo, helped by a huge distribution event tied to China's Spring Festival Gala, surged past 100 million daily active users during the holiday. Alibaba and Tencent responded with aggressive campaigns of their own. Alibaba reportedly used a major coupon giveaway tied to the Qwen chatbot, driving a sharp spike in usage.
After the holiday sugar rush wore off, Chan retained users better than Tencent's Yuanbao, even if it still trailed Doubao. That is revealing. It suggests Alibaba could buy attention, but its longer-term hope lay in practical utility, especially where AI could be integrated back into commerce flows. Reuters noted Chen's role in assisting with massive volumes of shopping orders. In other words, Alibaba's real consumer AI advantage may not be pure conversation. It may be workflow embedded in a shopping ecosystem. Even so, the field around Alibaba was getting more crowded and more dangerous. DeepSeek remained a disruptive reference point. ByteDance kept pressing with Doubao 2.0. Tencent was active. Smaller Chinese AI firms were growing faster than many incumbents would like.
Reuters reporting in early 2026 conveyed the atmosphere well. China's battle of the AI apps was intensifying, user giveaways were expensive, and nobody had yet found an obviously elegant monetization model for mass consumer AI in China. That uncertainty is crucial. Alibaba's AI strategy looks strongest where enterprise cloud demand and developer ecosystems are involved. On the pure consumer side, the company still faces the basic problem that usage can be bought faster than profits can be found. That is one reason the February 2026 launch of Chen 3.5 was so important. Alibaba presented it as a multimodal, more efficient, more agentic model built for the emerging agentic AI era. Reuters said the company claimed it was 60% cheaper and 8 times more capable in handling certain large workloads than its predecessor. The model was designed not merely to answer questions, but to take actions across desktop and mobile environments. Strategically, Chen 3.5 represented an attempt to move the conversation away from the old leaderboard obsession and toward the next commercially relevant question: which models can actually do things for people and businesses at tolerable cost? In that sense, Alibaba was trying to place itself where open models, enterprise tooling, and consumer task execution meet. Yet, almost immediately, that advance was clouded by execution concerns. In early March 2026, Reuters reported that Lin Junyang, the head of the Chen division, had resigned, joining other senior departures from the team earlier in the year. Days later, Reuters reported that Alibaba had responded by setting up a new task force to accelerate foundational model development under closer senior leadership, including Eddie Wu and other top technical executives. The corporate meaning of this episode is larger than one resignation. It shows that AI success creates its own instability. The more central Chen became to Alibaba's future, the more management could not tolerate even the appearance of drift, fragmentation, or internal disorder. If 2024 was the year Alibaba chose AI as a pillar, early 2026 was the moment it showed how willing it was to re-centralize power to defend that pillar. Meanwhile, outside China, globalization was running into harder political weather. Some of this pressure was diffuse, such as the general suspicion facing Chinese technology firms in Western markets. Some of it was more specific. Reuters reported in June 2025 that Apple and Alibaba's China AI rollout had been delayed by regulatory approval issues amid worsening U.S.-China tensions. In November 2025, Reuters reported on claims attributed to a U.S. national security memo described by the Financial Times that Alibaba was helping China's military. Alibaba denied the allegation. In January 2026, Reuters reported that Texas banned state employees from using Alibaba products and services on state-owned devices and networks. In February 2026, Reuters also reported that Alibaba briefly appeared and then disappeared from a U.S. government list of companies allegedly linked to China's military. None of these episodes by themselves destroyed Alibaba's global prospects. Together, they illustrate the fog in which Chinese global tech expansion now operates. E-commerce faced its own form of geopolitical and regulatory friction abroad. In South Korea, Reuters reported in 2024 that privacy regulators were looking into the data practices of platforms, including AliExpress, as Chinese cross-border shopping surged. In late 2025, South Korea's competition regulator approved the AliExpress G-Market joint venture only with conditions designed to prevent problematic sharing of user data. In Europe, the environment was hardening around low-value parcel imports from China. Reuters reported in early 2026 that the European Union was moving faster to tighten the treatment of low-value parcels from China, reflecting concern over the sheer scale of shipments from Chinese platforms and the strain those flows were putting on customs systems, consumer safety enforcement, and domestic retailers. AliExpress was not the sole target of those concerns, but it was unavoidably part of the category under scrutiny.
This is where Alibaba's duplicated challenge becomes clear. Global expansion still offered growth, especially where domestic China demand was soft and Chinese merchants needed new outlets. But the more successful Chinese cross-border commerce became, the more likely it was to provoke a regulatory response in destination markets. The same was true in cloud. The more ambitious Alibaba grew as a global AI and infrastructure player, the more exposed it became to export controls, security suspicion, and political screening.
In other words, globalization remained an opportunity, but it was no longer a neutral geography. It had become contested terrain. By early 2026, Alibaba therefore looked like a company simultaneously stronger and less comfortable than it had 2 years earlier. Stronger because it had found a strategic language that made sense. Stronger because cloud growth had reaccelerated sharply. Stronger because QN had become one of the world's most important open model families. Stronger because international commerce was moving closer to profitability. Stronger because the company had finally stopped trying to pretend that every legacy bet deserved equal love. But less comfortable because each gain had come with a corresponding pressure. AI leadership required vast spending. Consumer AI required subsidies and retention tactics. Instant commerce required margin sacrifice. Global expansion invited regulatory and political blowback. The company had not escaped struggle. It had chosen a more coherent version of struggle. One way to describe Alibaba's evolution from 2024 through early 2026 is that it moved from conglomerate logic to systems logic. Under conglomerate logic, value comes from owning many businesses and optimizing the portfolio. Under systems logic, value comes from reinforcing loops between a smaller set of strategically chosen capabilities. Alibaba's chosen loops were now plain. Commerce generates cash, demand, data, and user surfaces. AI and cloud convert those resources into infrastructure, tools, and model capability. Those capabilities then flow back into commerce to improve monetization, user retention, merchant efficiency, and new product creation. The company's divestitures, reorganizations, cloud capex, open source model releases, and membership programs all make more sense when viewed as attempts to tighten those loops. There is, however, a danger in admiring the architecture too quickly. Systems can be elegant on paper and punishing in reality. Alibaba's loop still depends on domestic consumption in China not collapsing into permanent malaise. It still depends on cloud and AI demand remaining strong enough to justify the capex wave. It still depends on open source leadership translating into monetization through infrastructure and services. It still depends on international platforms like AliExpress and Trendyol proving that they can grow without being regulated into mediocrity. It still depends on management executing through what increasingly looks like an arms race in both AI and fulfillment. The company has become conceptually sharper, yes, but sharpened steel can still break if it is bent too far. Even with those caveats, there is a compelling through line to the period. In 2024, Alibaba was still defining the pivot. In 2025, it funded the pivot and accelerated it. By early 2026, it was defending the pivot under real competitive and geopolitical pressure. That arc matters because it suggests Alibaba's future will not be decided by whether it can recover some imagined golden age of marketplace supremacy. That world is gone. The company's future will be decided by whether it can become the rare platform that remains central in commerce while also becoming indispensable in the AI stack. If it succeeds, Alibaba will not look like the old Alibaba with shinier tools. It will look like a different kind of company entirely, part consumption utility, part compute grid, part model ecosystem, part logistics web. As of March 8, 2026, that story remains unfinished. Alibaba had not yet reported its December 2025 quarter. The company had scheduled that release for March 19, 2026. So the most honest place to stop is not with a triumphal claim, but with a strategic snapshot. Alibaba has made its bet. It has chosen AI and cloud as the second growth curve and tied that curve tightly to the future of commerce. It has accepted lower comfort in exchange for greater coherence. It has sold assets that once embodied its ambitions and poured money into assets that embody its next ambition. It has made itself more legible. The remaining question is whether legibility will be enough in a world where every major front, from Chinese shopping apps to global cloud infrastructure, is becoming more crowded, more expensive, and more political at the same time. The international commerce story also becomes richer when one looks past the headline growth rates. AliExpress's choice service mattered not only because it lifted orders, but because it bundled together curation, fulfillment, and delivery expectations in a way that made the platform feel less like a chaotic bazaar and more like a managed storefront. In markets from Spain to South Korea to Brazil, that kind of operational tightening is a prerequisite for brand trust. Trendyol's push into the Gulf suggested that Alibaba's global portfolio could use regional champions rather than imposing a single model everywhere. Lazada's narrowing losses showed that discipline was possible even in Southeast Asia's fiercely competitive digital landscape. Alibaba.com's AI tools, including Akio, hinted that the old B2B roots of the company could be refreshed with modern procurement search and sourcing workflows. Together, these pieces formed a more credible globalization mosaic than the company had sometimes enjoyed in earlier years. Cainiao deserves a separate mention because it was easy to treat logistics as a supporting actor when, in reality, it was often the hidden condition of Alibaba's strategy. Cross-border commerce is not won only by cheaper goods or louder marketing, it is won by delivery times, warehouse placement, customs handling, local returns, and the ability to make low-value parcels move with enough reliability that consumers stop feeling they are gambling. That is why the synergy between AIDC and Cainiao appears so often in Alibaba's own materials. It was not filler, it was the spine of the international push. Every time Alibaba shortened delivery times or improved unit economics through tighter logistics integration, it was turning growth from a promotional event into something closer to a system. The 2025 cloud expansion plans likewise had a strategic subtext beyond mere geography. New data centers in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, Dubai, and later plans for Europe and Latin America were not simply about planting flags, they were about latency, regulatory fit, data residency, and credibility with enterprise customers who will not build serious workloads on distant infrastructure if local alternatives exist. For Alibaba, overseas cloud expansion also served the globalization of Chinese enterprises, many of which needed a familiar technology partner as they expanded abroad. In that sense, Alibaba Cloud's international build-out was not only about taking share from Western incumbents, it was also about following Chinese commerce, manufacturing, logistics, and digital services into other markets and becoming the connective tissue for that outward movement. Capital allocation in this period also tells a story about confidence and anxiety living side by side. Alibaba was repurchasing shares at a massive scale, paying dividends, and still committing extraordinary sums to AI and cloud infrastructure. On one reading, that is a sign of financial strength, and there is truth in that. Only a company with deep cash generation and a large balance sheet can do all three. But on another reading, it also reflects the burden of being a giant in a skeptical market. Buybacks and dividends reassured investors who wanted proof that the company would not vanish into a permanently deferred technological future. The AI CapEx program, by contrast, was a promise to those who feared Alibaba would underinvest and miss the next era. The company was managing two constituencies at once, shareholders who wanted discipline and a future that demanded audacity. One should also notice how often Alibaba's 2025 communications used the language of consumption rather than only retail. That vocabulary shift matters. Retail suggests transactions. Consumption suggests a much broader claim on time, habit, and everyday life. When Alibaba created cross-platform loyalty programs linking shopping, food delivery, and travel, and when it folded LMA and Fliddy into a more unified consumer apparatus, it was signaling that the next stage of competition would be won by whoever could turn fragmented digital utilities into a coherent daily experience. This is a direct answer to the reality that Chinese internet usage is no longer concentrated in a few simple platform categories. If Douyin is a content environment, Meituan a local services utility, JD a fulfillment machine, and PDD a value magnet, then Alibaba's response is to make Taobao the gateway to a wider consumption map. That broadening, however, raises its own execution hazard. The more Alibaba tries to become a comprehensive consumption platform, the more it risks recreating the sprawl it spent 2024 trying to escape. The difference is supposed to be integration quality. A set of services held together by ownership is one thing. A set of services unified by common identity, loyalty, data, and AI assistance is another. Whether Alibaba can keep that distinction alive will determine whether the China e-commerce group is remembered as a masterstroke or a relapse.
Integration can create synergies, but it can also create managerial fog. The company's history gives reason for both hope and caution. Finally, the geopolitical headwinds of 2025 and early 2026 matter not only because they threaten specific deals or market access, they also shape the discount rate investors and partners apply to Alibaba's future. A Chinese company building global cloud and AI infrastructure must now operate under persistent questions about export controls, national security lists, state-level bans, data localization rules, and the political meaning attached to critical digital infrastructure. Even where no direct sanction is imposed, the cost of suspicion is real. It can slow approvals, complicate partnerships, encourage customers to choose politically quieter providers, and make every overseas expansion feel provisional. Alibaba can still globalize under those conditions, but the path is narrower. It must win not just on product and price, but on trust, in a world where trust has become geopolitical. Alibaba's open-source posture also had a subtle diplomatic function in the global AI market. Closed models tend to centralize power inside the companies and countries that can afford the largest training runs and most restrictive distribution. Open models diffuse that power outward. For Alibaba, that diffusion was commercially useful, but it was also reputationally shrewd. In markets where an Alibaba-branded enterprise sale might be politically sensitive, a QN model downloaded from an open repository could still spread the company's technical standards, tooling habits, and developer familiarity. Over time, that can create a soft ecosystem advantage that is harder to regulate than a branded platform launch. The company was not only exporting products, it was exporting defaults. The Paris Olympics and other international showcases fit into that same logic. Alibaba's role as an Olympic cloud partner, its Euro 2024 association through AliExpress, and later public narratives around open-source AI were all ways of pushing the company into a different mental category. Alibaba did not want to be seen abroad only as the owner of bargain marketplaces flooded with cheap parcels. It wanted to be seen as a technology operator, an infrastructure partner, and, in the AI era, a serious innovator. Rebranding a company at that scale is slow work. Every data center opening, every high-profile partnership, every public benchmark win, and every global event deployment was part of that patient effort to redraw the outline. There is also an irony worth noting in the 2024 to 2026 period. The more Alibaba embraced AI, the more it returned to something close to its original infrastructure identity. In its early years, Alibaba's genius was not only selling things online, it was building the pipes, trust mechanisms, and operating tools that let other people do business. The AI and cloud pivot, in a strange way, is a modernized version of that same instinct. QN, Model Studio, Model Scope, cloud compute, logistics integration, merchant tools, cross-platform loyalty, procurement search, and instant delivery are all infrastructure of one kind or another. What changed is the layer of abstraction. Alibaba moved from marketplace infrastructure to digital intelligence infrastructure, but the family resemblance is real. That is why the company's horizon can be described in one sentence. Alibaba is trying to become the place where business, consumer demand, and machine intelligence meet. That is an enormous ambition, larger than defend Taobao, and more grounded than pure AGI fantasy. It is ambitious enough to justify the spending, broad enough to connect the company's major assets, and concrete enough to be tested quarter by quarter.
The years 2024 to early 2026 did not prove that Alibaba will win that contest. They did show that the company finally understands the contest it is in. Taken together, the years from 2024 through early 2026 show Alibaba becoming more strategically coherent and more operationally exposed at the same time. It became clearer about what it was trying to be, but clarity required bigger bets, sharper trade-offs, and more open confrontation with rivals and regulators. That tension is the essence of Alibaba's horizon. The company is no longer deciding whether to pivot, it is now living inside the consequences of the pivot.